Hey, what's up, everyone? Coming to you live from my mom's basement with another critique of the pseudo-intellectual Warren Smith. Warren has been pumping out content recently, trying to capitalize on his viral J.K. Rowling video that came out a while back, which apparently got the Elon Musk bump. Not surprising. Well, anyway, today we are going to look at a couple of Warren's videos and see if we can refute some of the points that he makes. In the first video, Warren gives us a little YouTube review
These little YouTube reviews
of Matt Walsh's new movie, Am I a Racist? Warren, you want to say something?
These little YouTube reviews.
Okay, Warren, we get it. It's a little YouTube review. Now, I haven't seen the film, but for the purposes of this video, it isn't really necessary. I'm going to be focusing on the factual and logical errors that Warren makes throughout his...
These little YouTube reviews.
Warren, stop that, okay? Gosh. As part of his analysis of the film, Warren claims that anti-racists have redefined racism, and gives us an example from a conversation he had with his professor, who is definitely not his dad. Come on, guys, stop saying that.
I think it's about how racism has been redefined.
Let's make policies that are schoolyard fair.
What is racism?
Racism in our country today is that we have 40 million African Americans who feel like they're owed something.
That's not racism. And the grift built upon that redefinition, how it has been utilized as a tool, and this story has been created around racism in society today, and it has led to an industry.
Whoa, man, that is deep. Well, not really. First of all, I'm not really sure he provided this redefinition that anti-racists are supposedly using. The professor he cuts to doesn't really give us a clear definition and is kind of just incoherent, and yet Warren is using his professor's incompetence on this topic as a way of showing how silly leftists are. He's not really being precise here, as Jordan Peterson would have it. I really thought he would have gone into a critique of institutional racism at this point, which would have been interesting, but he doesn't. Maybe he'll bring it up later, though. As to his point about anti-racism producing a lucrative industry whose leaders appear to be cynical and money-hungry, I don't think he's entirely wrong. But then he says something like this.
They need conflict drives story. That's lesson number one for screenwriters. They need the conflict to be alive. They need to keep the conflict. If you remove the conflict from the story, you no longer have the motivation for the people to come to listen to the speakers. They need racism to be relevant today in order to be able to charge these speaking fees.
And there it is. Warren, your galaxy brain is showing. Warren is claiming that the presence and societal impact of racism today is largely manufactured by the anti-racist industrial complex, both by exaggerating its prevalence and redefining it, which we still didn't get that new definition. I'm going to go ahead and assume he means systemic racism, which is not a new concept. Warren believes that D'Angelo and people like her aren't just taking advantage of racism by charging exorbitant speaking and consulting fees, but that they're actually creating racial tension where there would otherwise be none. If D'Angelo and company never talked about racism, then the problem would just go away. But not completely, of course.
There will always be racism.
Well, this is bullshit. Sure, Robin D'Angelo is a grifter. I'll give him that. But that doesn't mean racism isn't still a significant part of the human experience in the United States today. Warren thinks that only individual racism exists, and only just barely, and that systemic racism is no longer an issue. When it comes to individual racism, Warren implies that it's truly an insignificant problem that has to be hyped up by anti-racists. But this is simply refuted by the facts. White supremacist and neo-Nazi groups like the Proud Boys, Patriot Front, and the Groypers have gained popularity in recent years. Hate crimes, as reported by the FBI, have been trending up over the last 5 to 10 years, not down. And I know I can hear some of you saying, actually, when you talk about racism and racial inequality all the time, you're just going to piss people off and turn them into racists or make them even more racist. Well, I'm sorry, if you actually believe that, then you're self-reporting. I've never read about or heard people discuss racism and thought, oh boy, I guess I hate black people now, even if I thought the analysis was wrong or inflammatory. If learning about racism in this country pushes you to be a racist or more racist, then guess what? You were already racist. The failed former president is promoting bullshit claims about Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs, stoking anti-immigrant fears in his base, and it's clearly working. So no, individual racism is not just a blip on the radar. Now on to systemic racism. Warren has some rather simplistic thoughts on the matter.
But if we cannot point to a racist law, and yet we're going to still claim institutional racism.
I'm telling you that the government that they live under and pay taxes to created laws that allowed all of those things to happen and thus are responsible for that.
But those laws do not exist today.
They have been repealed, many of them.
If you can you articulate a single law that exists today?
What is it? But it doesn't matter if the law was yesterday. The point is, the government still exists.
It does. Isn't that that is the point? That is what matters. If it doesn't exist today, it's not an issue. That's the view of reality, meaning like the present. You're looking at problems within the past and saying that they relate to the present, even though they're not presents. They're not flaws that exist within the present. That's a flawed view of reality. If you sell that view to the future generation, it's going to exacerbate the problem.
Warren is saying three things here. 1, there are no racist laws today. 2, racist laws of the past do not present difficulties for people alive today. Even if they did, the government has no moral obligation to repay the debt to black and brown people that was accrued through systemic discrimination, because it happened in the past, I guess. And 3, this is just an inference because Warren doesn't say it explicitly, so if I'm wrong, then that's my bad. But Warren seems to think that systemic racism is only a function of racist laws. So let's address these one at a time. On the first point, there are no racist laws. Look, this is a common right-wing talking point. If you can't name a law that's explicitly racist, then there are no racist laws. But that is how babies think. Laws can be written in a way that disproportionately affects a group of people without referencing that group's racial identity. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses under Jim Crow made no mention of blacks or whites. But we know that black people's rights were clearly targeted. Under the New Deal, agricultural and domestic workers were excluded from Social Security and labor protections. It just so happened that most black workers fell into these categories. And the senators who removed those labor categories from the law did have explicitly racist intentions, but were able to mask them with colorblind language. There are plenty of examples of this type of phenomenon, not just in the past, but today as well. An obvious one is how black people are treated by the criminal justice system. Young black kids are 4 times more likely to be detained or thrown in juvie than white kids. Black men get 20% longer sentences for the exact same crime, even accounting for criminal history, age, and education. Federal prosecutors are twice as likely to charge black people with offenses that come with a mandatory minimum sentence than white people. Even though the criminal justice system is devoid of explicitly racist sentencing laws, it often produces racist consequences. Here's another example from Ryan Grimm.
Okay, so if you go to Georgia, for instance, after they implemented school desegregation, what they started doing is saying, oh, okay, well, we can't legally keep black people out of our neighborhoods or out of our schools, but what we can do is we can secede from our neighborhoods. I mean, you've been to the Atlanta suburbs?
A little bit.
Like every 4...
Unfortunately.
Like every 4 blocks.
Try to stay away.
Yeah.
Like every 4 blocks for a long time, you had like new school districts, and they would be drawn. They would be just basically gerrymandered. Like they would know where the white people were, and they would gerrymander the school district so that only white people would be at part of this.
Yeah, but you're going back to desegregation.
No. This is what they're doing now. Like this is up to today.
Oh, shit. Just as a side note, if you haven't seen the full video, Ryan Grimm makes Matt Walsh look like a complete fucking moron. Like, I'm surprised Ben Shapiro let him out of his basement to go on that show and make a fool of himself. Okay, so we've seen that just because a law doesn't use racist language doesn't mean they can't be racist. In fact, they very clearly can be racist. So point 1 has been debunked. On to point 2. Warren, can you remind us of point 2 again? I forgot.
If the law was yesterday, the point is the government still exists.
It does. Isn't that that is the point? That is what matters. If it's not, if it doesn't exist today, it's not an issue.
Whoa, that's a bold claim with zero evidence. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. Racist laws of the past very clearly affect people along racial lines today. Just a few examples. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave millions of whites a massive head start by handing out free land that belonged to natives, which allowed for intergenerational wealth to be accumulated and passed down. Black people were not given the same welfare assistance from the government. De jure, meaning legally mandated, racial segregation in schools and neighborhoods has led to worse academic and economic outcomes. Black and brown people were pushed into areas where factories polluted the environment, which negatively impacted the health of residents of those neighborhoods. And many schools and neighborhoods continue to be segregated today, creating a vicious cycle of poverty. These laws of the past that spill into the present at least partially explain the racial inequality we see in terms of income, wealth, academic achievement, and political representation today. And what's interesting is that none of these racial discrepancies require any one person to be racist in order to continue. Now, the question is whether the government has any moral responsibility in alleviating the consequences of past discrimination. And if it does, what can be done so that black and brown people are given justice without alienating or leaving out white people who are also impoverished? Well, does the government have an obligation to help people affected by the downstream consequences of slavery, the black codes, Jim Crow, and other forms of systemic racism? Warren would say no for the simple reason that those laws don't exist today. But why? He never really gives an explanation. If racial disparities as a function of systemic discrimination disappeared overnight after the civil rights legislation in the 1960s, then sure, I guess. But that didn't happen. In fact, people who were affected by Jim Crow laws are still alive today. Not only that, the economic, social, and political ramifications were passed down from those who were directly impacted to their children and grandchildren. When black people were legally discriminated against, they weren't able to build generational wealth, which is typically through homeownership. That alone is huge because, unfortunately, a big factor of people's wealth is tied up in homeownership. So not only are people who are affected by these past laws never made whole, their children and grandchildren were affected by the generational impact of these policies. The government clearly caused harm to millions of people based on their race and should therefore pay damages. Just because those laws don't exist anymore doesn't really mean anything. Okay, so what should the government do? Well, I think that implementing universal social programs that many other rich countries have done is a good start. These programs, like universal health care, child care, tuition-free college, social housing, would disproportionately benefit poor minorities, but would help Americans of all races. Not only should the government do something, it can do something. All right, moving on. Where were we? Was it point 3? Yeah, point 3. In discussing systemic or institutional racism, Warren tends to hyper-focus on laws, indicating he believes that the legal system is the only source of it. Again, this is how little babies think. And this guy is 36? Come on, man, grow up. The government isn't the only institution in our society, my dude. Systemic or institutional racism includes economic, political, legal, school, and healthcare systems. I'm going to give just one example for the sake of brevity, and that is banking discrimination. Obviously, in the past, black and brown people were denied access to financial services based on their race in a practice known as redlining. But this sort of thing is not just a relic of the past. It's still happening. All right, point 3 has been debunked. So what have we seen in these
little YouTube reviews
of Matt Walsh's I Am a Racist movie? Well, that Warren fails to grasp the nuances and complexities of yet another topic, that of racism. It appears that Warren has done almost no research and is mostly parroting Ben Shapiro's greatest hits from 2016. Warren, if you're watching this, before you post another video, I suggest you do a little more thinking and researching, which are core components of critical thinking.